Today I'm going to discuss two new concepts about working in Adobe Illustrator: working with layers and making clipping masks. Let's talk first about working with layers. You've probably noticed that as you create objects in Illustrator, they're stacked on top of one another, so that each new object is positioned on top of or in front of the existing objects. Let me select these and give them some different colors so that we can more easily distinguish them. Make a couple more. Okay, so you can see how each subsequent object overlaps the ones that I made previously, so that the first objects I create are in the background and the new objects that I create sit in front, in the foreground. You're going to encounter lots of instances where you want to change the order of the stacking of these objects. Something that you created later, you may actually want it to appear to be behind some of the other objects. So for example, let's say that we wanted to take this blue polygon and move it behind some of the others. There's a submenu under the Object menu called Arrange that allows you to change the stacking order of any of these objects. There's a command called Send Backward, which moves an object farther back in this stack one step at a time. So we can do send backward once, send backward again. Now it's behind the white object, but it's probably still in front of that yellow one. Send backward again, we'll send it behind the yellow one, but it's still in front of the red, the blue, and the white ones. We can also choose send to back, which sends it all the way to the very bottom of the stack, behind all of the other objects. Likewise, we have a bring forward command that brings the object forward in the stack one step at a time. And we also have the bring to front option, which brings it all the way to the front of the stack. In addition to these options to move objects either forward or backward within the stack, there's also a feature of Illustrator that lets you draw new objects behind existing objects. Normally the default is that every new object is drawn in front of the existing objects, but this other feature allows you to draw behind the currently existing objects. In order to show you this, I'm going to adjust my tool palette, because this feature sits at the very bottom of the tool palette. Let me click on this little set of arrows here in the upper left corner of the toolbar, and that resizes the toolbar, so now we can see the whole thing. And you'll see that there's a group of icons down here at the bottom of the toolbar. The icon on the left, if I position the cursor over it, it says Draw Normal. That's the normal way of drawing, where each subsequent object lies in front of the ones that were made before. But the next icon is called Draw Behind. And this allows me to draw behind some selected object. What I have to do in order to use this is I first have to select some object in the group here. Let me select this yellow polygon. And now I'm going to choose the Draw Behind icon. And let me just grab some different shape here, and I'll begin to draw some additional objects. So there's an ellipse. Let me change the color of it a little bit. You can see that that ellipse was drawn behind the selected yellow object, which means it's also behind the white polygon, the orange polygon, and the blue polygon. If I draw another object, choose a rectangle this time, it's drawn behind the last one that was selected. So the ellipse was selected before, so now this new object is drawn behind that one. And I'll create a star now. This object lies behind the pink rectangle that I just created. So each subsequent object lies behind whichever one was previously selected. Before I do anything else, I want to make sure I go back to my tool palette and reselect the Draw Normal icon. If I didn't do that, if I left Draw Behind selected, then every new object I created would be drawn behind the existing ones, which could get a little bit confusing. This whole concept of the stacking of objects on top of one another is very closely related to the concept of layers in Illustrator. When you draw a group of objects, they're automatically grouped together on a particular layer. In this case, there's just a single layer called Layer 1. Notice that each layer has a name, in this case just Layer 1. To the left of the name is a small thumbnail that shows what the artwork on that layer looks like. To the left of that is a small triangle that I can click on, and that expands the layer, and we see that every object has its own sublayer inside of Layer 1. And because one of the objects, this pink rectangle with the rounded corners, is currently selected, a colored dot appears at the far right-hand side next to that object's sublayer. Let me click on the triangle again to collapse the layer. I can have as many layers as I want in my illustration, and I can place different artwork on different layers. To create a new layer, I simply select this icon that looks like a little page with the corner flipped over. You see that it says Create New Layer when I hover the mouse over it. And it automatically creates a new layer, in this case called Layer 2. Notice also that Layer 2 has a light blue highlight behind it. That means that Layer 2 is the currently active layer. So as I create additional artwork, that additional artwork is automatically placed onto whichever layer is currently active. So all of these ellipses and circles that I'm creating are all being placed on Layer 2, and you can see from the thumbnail that it's showing only the pink circles that are on that layer. And again, if I click on this little triangle to expand it, you see that this entire layer consists of a group of pink ellipses and circles. If I were to click on Layer 1, notice that Layer 1 now has that blue highlighting, and any objects I draw now are placed on Layer 1. Because Layer 2 sits above Layer 1 here in the Layers palette, it means that all of the objects on Layer 2 are in front of any of the objects in Layer 1. That's why as I draw additional objects on Layer 2, and let me give them a different color so they're easier to distinguish. As I draw objects on Layer 2, they may be in front of the other objects on Layer 1, but they lie behind the pink circles on Layer 2. Now I can easily change the order of these two layers, similar to the way that I can send objects forward or backward on a single layer. I can move one layer relative to another. All I have to do is grab one of these layers and drag it up or down within the stack of layers. So if I grab Layer 2 and simply drag it down below Layer 1, now all of those pink circles on Layer 2 are behind all of the artwork on Layer 1. And I can do the opposite and drag Layer 1 now behind Layer 2. Let me select one of the objects on Layer 1. And I'm going to choose one that's way in the background. It's buried under a bunch of other objects. Let me select that blue polygon back there. You remember just a few minutes ago, I showed you how you can move objects forward or backward within the stack using these arrange commands like bring to front, send backwards, and so on. When I say bring to front, it pulls that object to the top of the stack or the front of the stack of objects, but it only does so on its own layer. So this blue polygon is now the foreground object on layer 1, but it did not move it in front of the objects on layer 2. All of layer 2 is still in front of all of the objects on layer 1. Now, if I really wanted to bring that blue polygon to the foreground so it was in front of everything else, I would have to move it from layer 1 onto layer 2 and then bring it forward in the stack on layer 2. So how do you move an object from one layer to another? Well, remember I showed you that when an object is selected, there's a little blue dot that appears next to the icon for that object. So I've just expanded layer 1. And we see a list of all of the objects on layer 1. And you'll see how that blue polygon sits at the very top of the stack of objects on layer 1. If I want to move that object from layer 1 onto layer 2, I simply drag that blue dot that indicates that it's selected from layer 1 up onto layer 2. That blue polygon is now on layer 2. If I expand layer 2, you'll see that it sits at the top of the stack on layer 2. I could move it relative to those pink circles on layer 2, either by using the arrange commands to send backward. You see how it moved it down one layer in the stack. Or I could even grab the object and drag it farther back in the stack from here. So you actually have a couple different ways of changing the stacking order of objects within a particular layer. A couple other things you can do with layers. You can give a layer a custom name. So instead of just layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and so on, if you double-click on the name of the layer, it highlights the name, and we can call this something. And then I find it very useful to name the layers to keep track of what kinds of objects you've placed on each layer. For example, if you're illustrating anatomic structures, you might have abdominal organs on one layer, thoracic organs on another layer, bones on another layer, muscles on another layer, and so on. It makes it much easier to keep track of which object is on which layer if the names make sense. You can also make layers visible or invisible. It's very simple. There's a little eyeball icon at the far left end of each layer. Simply click the eyeball to hide it, click again to make it visible, hide, make it visible. You can also lock layers. This empty space to the right of the eyeball allows you to lock all of the objects on a layer. So now if I were to grab my selection arrow and drag a great big selection around all of these objects, it's only going to select the objects on the random shape layer, and it selected none of the objects on the pink circles layer because that layer was locked. Unlock that layer, and I'm now going to delete all of these objects. And in fact, I'm going to delete one of the layers. If you decide that you want to delete a layer, you simply highlight the layer and click on the little trash can icon in the bottom right corner of the layers palette. If there's artwork still on the layer, you'll get a warning. It will say, are you sure you want to delete this? Because deleting the layer will also delete the artwork. Now let me show you a couple of real applications of layers, instead of just creating a bunch of random shapes and placing them on different layers. Here's one of my favorite uses for layers. I find that I produce better artwork if I create a good pencil sketch before I actually sit down at the computer. For me, my brain just seems to function better with a pencil in my hand and just doodling on paper. And I work out the composition, the layout, the organization of the illustration on paper before I ever turn on the computer. I'll then scan the sketch into the computer, and what I'll do is I'll place the sketch into Illustrator and then trace over it. So let me show you how that works. I already have a sketch that I've scanned in. I'm going to go to the File menu, and about halfway down there's a command called Place. I've already got the right folder open. I have something here called Sketch Template. I'm going to click Place, and now what you see is a little thumbnail that I can position anywhere on screen that I want. And when I click, it places that sketch onto the currently active layer. When I create my artwork, I don't want to create the Illustrator artwork on the same layer as the sketch, because when I've completed the Illustrator artwork, I want to be able to delete the sketch very easily. So I'm going to leave the sketch on this layer and lock the layer, and then create a new layer where I'll actually start creating my artwork. So on this layer, I'll just do this kind of quick and dirty. I'll start tracing right over my pencil sketch. Now you'll notice as I do this, the artwork that I'm creating has a black fill. And alternatively, since I'm basically trying to draw a black outline here, I might have a white fill and a black stroke. Make that a little thicker. But either way, the fill color is obscuring the sketch in the background. Now, one possible solution to that might be to give this object a fill of none, and that way my sketch is going to continue to show through. But let's say I didn't want a fill of none. Let's say I actually wanted this to be filled with white. Or let's say I was illustrating something else and I was putting gradients or patterns or something inside the objects. I really couldn't afford to make all of my objects with no fill. If I've created artwork that has some kind of fill and it's hiding my pencil sketch, how do I continue to draw if the sketch becomes hidden? Especially when I go back later and try to draw all of the internal details of this face. When I try to draw the eyes and the ears and the hair, all of those things are now hidden. Let me show you a really handy little trick. I mentioned before that you can hide a layer. Well, that allows me to see my sketch, but now I can't work on the artwork on layer 2 because it's hidden. When I make layer 2 visible again, then I can't see the sketch. You definitely don't want to have to keep toggling back and forth, drawing a little bit and then making it invisible and then drawing a little bit more. That would be a nightmare. So here's what you can do. First, I need to explain the difference between what's called outline mode and preview mode in Illustrator. If you go up to the View menu, the very first option here says Outline. When I select this, every object that's been created appears as just a simple little outline with no stroke color, no stroke weight, no fill. So if there were patterns and things in here or gradients, all of that stuff would disappear. And all I would see is just this thin little black outline. So that allows me to see through layer 2 to see what's behind it. But unfortunately, when I go into outline mode, any raster artwork that I have placed into the image, such as my sketch, appears as just a big box with an X through it, like you see there. So I can't really work in outline mode either because I can't see my sketch. Normally we work in what's called preview mode. So let me switch back to preview mode, which is where you can actually see the fill color, the stroke color, patterns, gradients, and so on that you've placed in your objects. And you need to be in preview mode in order to be able to see the sketch. But unfortunately, as we mentioned before, the fill color of the Illustrator artwork is now obscuring the sketch. Okay, so what does this have to do with layers? There's a little trick that I can use to make one of these layers appear in outline mode while leaving the other layer in preview mode. And here's how it works. I have to hold down the Command key on the keyboard. And while holding the Command key, I click the eyeball icon on layer 2. Notice what happened to the eyeball icon on layer 2. The eye didn't disappear completely. Instead, the eye is represented by just an outline, indicating that this one layer is now in outline mode. And it's a little hard to see, but if I drag the selection arrow here, you can see that my path is still there. Meanwhile, the layer that has my sketch on it is still in preview mode, so it's still visible. So now I can continue to draw this outline around the face without covering up the sketch. This line still has a black stroke and a white fill. It's just that we can't see it at the moment because this particular layer is being viewed in outline mode. So more importantly, now I can draw things like the ear and the eye Now when I want to return layer 2 back to preview mode so I can actually see what the fill color looks like, or again if I had gradients or fill patterns or something in these objects, I'd want to be able to see all of that stuff. I do the same thing. I simply hold down the Command key and click on the eyeball icon, and it restores it back to preview mode. So now we see these objects with their white fill color, or if I had given them some other kind of fill color, we would see that now. So this technique of command clicking on the eyeball icon on a particular layer is very handy when you need to be able to see the background layers and still work on the foreground layers at the same time. Here's another real-world use of lots of layers. I mentioned before that when I'm working on a complex illustration that includes structures on many different layers, I like to name the layers with recognizable names so I know exactly what's on each layer. Now layer 1, I left it as just layer 1, but I could have called that skin or something like that. Above the skin layer is a skeleton layer, which actually includes just the pelvis, the heads of the femurs, the scapula, and the humerus. Some of the other bones are on a different layer because things like the rib cage and the sternum, they have to be in front of some of the organs. Then abdominal organs, the trachea and bronchi, the heart, the lungs, and then the layer that's at the top of the stack is the layer that includes the ribs, the sternum, and also happens to include the clavicles. So let's see what this looks like if I were to hide some of these layers. I can hide the rib cage, the sternum, and the clavicles. I could hide just the lungs, and that reveals the branching pattern of the bronchi behind it. The heart, the trachea and bronchi, the abdominal organs, and the skeleton. And it's kind of interesting that I left the bladder on the same layer with the skin, but probably because the bladder had to be behind the pubic symphysis of the pelvis. So I think it's very useful to organize your artwork into layers like this and to give the layers meaningful names so it's easy to know exactly what's on each layer. Next, I'd like to talk to you about using clipping masks in Illustrator. A clipping mask is any object created in Illustrator which is used to crop other objects so that the other objects are visible only inside the masking object. And those objects are hidden where they fall outside of the masking object. Let me demonstrate. I've just grabbed any shape here. It doesn't make any difference what kind of object. It could be something you draw with the pen tool. It could be one of these geometric shapes. Really, any object at all can be a mask. I'm just going to draw this hexagon on top of the anatomical art. The hexagon is on the top layer here, so it sits in front of all of the other artwork. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the hexagon and all of the anatomical artwork on all of those other layers. And I'm going to use a command that makes a clipping mask. And what will happen is that all of the anatomical artwork will only be visible where it falls inside of this hexagonal shape. And any of the artwork that extends out beyond the edges of the hexagon will be hidden. It's important to remember that the object that is going to function as the mask has to be the thing that's closest to you. It has to be at the very top of the stack. So you can see that the hexagon is placed in the very topmost layer, and it's the topmost object on that particular layer. And I'm going to drag a selection all the way around the hexagon and all of the anatomical art. And you see how it's selected things on all the layers. That's why all these little colored dots appeared. I'm going to go to the Object menu, down here to Clipping Mask, and say Make. And you see what it's done. Just as I predicted, the anatomical artwork is visible where it falls inside the hexagonal shape, and any artwork that extends out beyond the hexagon is temporarily hidden. The artwork is still there. In fact, if I were to click on the edge of the skin outline, you can see that that vector shape is still there. It's just been hidden by the mask. And I could draw some other object and send this other object to the back, and you see that the other object is now visible, which proves that the anatomical artwork is truly hidden down here, where it extends beyond the edges of that hexagon. I can still select any of the artwork that falls inside the mask, which means I could actually continue to modify or edit any of those objects inside the mask. But I want to draw your attention to the Layers palette, and you may notice that all of these other layers are now blank. The little thumbnails have all become blank. That's because of something very unfortunate about the way Illustrator creates these clipping paths. It takes all of the objects, regardless of what layer they're on, and drags them all onto the same layer where the masking object is located. So you remember I drew that hexagon on the layer with the ribs and sternum, and when I created the mask, it then dragged all of the artwork from all of these other layers and placed it on that same layer with the ribs and sternum. When I expand the ribs and sternum layer, you'll see that there's another sublayer here, and if you could see the full name, it would say that it's a clipping group, meaning that all of those objects have been grouped inside a clipping mask. But now if I expand the clipping group, you'll see that every single individual object forms its own little sublayer here under that clipping group. This is very unfortunate because it means I can no longer select objects individually based on which layer they're on. It's particularly unfortunate because Illustrator didn't used to do it this way. The earlier versions of Illustrator that I worked on actually allowed the artwork to remain on its original layer even if you placed a clipping mask on the top layer. It's only been the last couple versions of Illustrator that have done this, where it's dragged all of the artwork onto this layer. And I've complained about this to Adobe, but nobody seems to want to listen to me. After you've created this clipping mask, you can still select the mask object itself. there still is a path here that defines the edge of that hexagon. And if I use the white arrow, I can select individual anchor points on that hexagon and modify them, which can allow me to reveal more of the artwork or crop in tighter on the artwork and reveal less of it. So when would you use a mask like this? What are some real-world applications of the clipping mask? Well, let me show you a couple of examples. This is an illustration I created quite a few years ago, which is showing some cancerous cysts that occur in the skin. This is a cross-sectional view of the skin, very highly magnified so we can see the individual cells in the epidermis. These are what are called keratocytes, which form the epidermis, and they also form the tough layer of keratin protein on the outside of the skin. And these circular structures down in the dermis, these are clusters of keratin which are abnormal, that are produced by these particular types of cysts. If you take a look at the edge of this piece of artwork, you realize that it's quite complex because it's made up of lots and lots of little shapes representing the individual cells within the epidermis. Can you imagine how difficult it would be if I had to draw each and every one of these little cell shapes so that it ended precisely along this edge over here and didn't extend even a millimeter beyond the edge? Now I placed a little black line here over the edge of the artwork, which would cover up a little bit of unevenness, but still it would be a real nightmare to try to get every single one of these objects to line up so perfectly along the edge of the artwork. So instead what I did was I created the artwork pretty sloppy and didn't worry at all about trying to get these cells to line up perfectly with one another along the edge, because I knew that after I had drawn all of the cells and all of these keratin cyst structures, that I'd be able to place a rectangular shape over the top of them and turn that into a mask. So I can simply select the rectangle and all of the artwork behind it, go back to the Object menu, Clipping Mask, Make. Now you may remember that in this version there was a blue background and also a black outline around the outside of the artwork. That's very easy to do because you can still select the clipping mask object, and if I give the clipping mask object a fill color, like let's say I gave it 15% cyan, 5% magenta, the fill color of the mask only fills in areas that are transparent, where there's no artwork. So essentially this is adding a background color behind the masked artwork. And I can also apply a stroke to the outside of the clipping mask object. Let me undo that. I'm hitting Command-Z on the keyboard, and use this illustration to explain another useful feature of clipping masks. I'm going to select and delete the existing mask object. When you create artwork professionally for a client, the client will often tell you the exact size that the illustration needs to be. For example, if you're creating artwork that's going to appear in a book or magazine, the text on each page is typically arranged into columns, and those columns have a very specific width. And it's up to the illustrator to make sure that their artwork is sized to fit exactly within those specified dimensions. A clipping mask can be a very useful way of ensuring that the artwork fits exactly within certain specified dimensions. I'm going to grab the rectangle tool and position it near the artwork, and I'm just going to click with the rectangle tool and it will bring up a dialog box where I can enter precise measurements for the height and width of the rectangle. Now let's say that I'm working for a publisher and they tell me that they want this illustration to be exactly 22 picas in width by 22 picas in height. Now you probably don't know what a pica is yet, but we'll talk about that very soon. But it's a unit of measurement that's used only in the publishing industry. And the way you designate picas is you actually enter a number, 22, and then you have to put a P followed by a 0. It's a little bit strange, but that's how it's done. And I'm going to tab into the next space, 22P0. What happened up here is that Illustrator automatically converted the measurements of picas into measurements in points. It's the same size, it's just a different way of writing the same size. And now when I click OK, it's going to create a rectangle, which is exactly 22 picas square. And it just so happens that that was approximately the size of the mask that I had before, because I did, in fact, create this illustration for a publisher that wanted it at exactly that size. So now I know when I select my clipping mask and my artwork and turn this into a mask, Object, Clipping Mask, Make, the artwork is now sized to the exact dimensions that the publisher has specified. And once again, I'll give this a fill color. And a thin black stroke. So now my artwork is sized to the exact size that the publisher requested, and it's ready for me to send it to them electronically. Another handy use for clipping masks is to create an inset in an illustration. Here's an example of an illustration that actually includes two different insets. So what we have here is some artwork that's been created in the background, this illustration of the heart and a little bit of text. And then there are two insets, which are enlargements of that small circular area showing one of the coronary arteries on the surface of the heart. Each of these circular areas is contained inside a clipping mask. So the heart and the colored background is included on this layer called layer 7. I can hide that. The text is all on its own layer. And as I said, each of these circular areas is its own clipping mask on its own layer. So one inset, inset 1, and another inset, inset 2. Let's take a look at how each of these is created. Notice that all the layers are locked, so I have to unlock them. So let me unlock inset 1 and demonstrate to you how this is created. I'm going to grab my group selection tool so that I can quickly select this entire circular shape, which is the mask. One thing I haven't shown you yet is that after you've created a mask, you can actually release the mask. In other words, leave the circular object where it is, but turn it off so that it no longer functions as a mask. I've selected the mask. I go up to the Object menu, back to Clipping Mask, and I can say Release, which converts the object back into just a circle filled in with this pale green with a black stroke. I'm going to get rid of the fill color and give it a fill of none so we can see the artwork behind it. And you can see in this case, the artwork for this enlarged view of the coronary artery extends way beyond the edge of the mask. I did that intentionally because I wasn't sure exactly how much of the artery I was going to show in this inset. I thought it was possible that I might actually show quite a bit more of the artery extending over here. So I made the artery a lot longer than it needed to be, and so I could either make the inset larger or smaller depending on what I thought looked better, and also depending on what the particular client was interested in. So this started out as just the illustration of the coronary artery. I grabbed the ellipse tool, and remember to create an ellipse which is a perfect circle. You want to hold down the Shift key. That's going to constrain the proportions so that the height and width are identical. I select the circle as well as all of the artwork that I want to include inside the mask. And I could go up to the Object menu and choose Clipping Mask, Make, or notice to the right of the Make command is this little symbol that looks sort of like a little clover leaf. That represents the Command key on the Apple keyboard, and then the number 7. What that's telling me is that I can execute that same command by holding down the Command key and just typing the number 7, Command 7. And I've created my mask. And then with the white arrow, I select the mask object. Let me put that pale sort of greenish color back in there. And the black outline. Now at some later time I might decide that I want to show a little bit more of the artery, kind of like I did in the lower inset. So I could scale the circle to reveal a little bit more. And I could reposition it if I wanted to change exactly which part of the artery was visible. Turn all the other layers back on, and we can see what it looks like. Okay, so that's another handy use for clipping masks, is to create these kind of blow-ups or insets. Here's another use for clipping masks. To create a cutaway or a window where it appears that we're looking inside this structure here. This is an illustration of the hepatitis B virus, and it consists of 4 layers. 1 layer is just the text, and then 3 layers to create the different parts of the virus. 2 of the layers are for all of these blue and kind of greenish colored proteins which make up most of the virus structure. Then there's a 3rd layer for this cutaway view where it appears that we're actually looking into the interior of the virus to see this double strand of DNA and a couple of polymerase enzymes that reside in the interior of the virus. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. You might assume from looking at this that the cutaway layer with this DNA is actually behind these blue spherical proteins, because it appears that we've actually cut away those blue spherical proteins to reveal the DNA behind them. But in reality, if you look at the layers palette, you'll see that the cutaway layer is actually sitting on top of the other layers. So I can hide the outer envelope and what's called the capsid, which is all of those blue spheres, and we see the cutaway. Let me unlock that layer so we can explore it a little bit more. This shape that has the scalloped edge on it is the actual mask. And inside that mask is a light blue gradient as well as a darker blue shape. When I select part of the DNA strand, you can see that part of it actually extends beyond the edge of the mask because it's hiding inside of a mask. Let me select the mask shape again and release it so that you can see a little more clearly how this was created. I'm going to go to Object menu, Clipping Mask, and Release. And so now we see how this was constructed. There's a light blue shape that represents one part of the cut edge of this cutaway through those blue spheres. There's a darker blue object behind that which is showing the interior of the cut section into the interior of the virus. And then you see that this DNA strand actually forms a complete loop, but we only see a small part of it inside the mask. So then this clipping mask shape sits on top of all those other objects. Remember that the mask shape, the shape that you're going to use as the mask, has to be the frontmost or the topmost object. So I'm going to select the mask shape and all of the other artwork. Go back to the object menu, clipping mask, make, and we have our mask back again. And then I'll turn on the layer with the blue spheres, and you can see what I've tried to do here is shape the mask so that it appears to be a cutaway through each of those blue spheres. So masks are very useful for creating this sort of cutaway or cut section view into the interior of another object. Last thing I want to show you is that you can also use clipping masks to mask raster artwork which has been placed into Illustrator. This is an illustration of a knee with rheumatoid arthritis. This illustration was created in Photoshop, so it's a piece of raster artwork, but I've placed it here into an Illustrator file. And I'm going to select just some random object here, a star, and I'll give it a fill so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And let's say for some crazy reason I wanted to place this raster artwork inside of a star-shaped mask. Let me enlarge that star a little bit. And now I'm going to select the raster artwork, the placed raster artwork, as well as the star. And let me use the keyboard shortcut, Command key and 7. And you can see how it is able to mask raster artwork as well.